Hey everybody, sorry for the technical difficulty. I'm hoping that you hear me better, and I got this fun guy in the mail today. His name is Andy. He's our ancestral dragon, so hopefully in my new book, Your Brain is Always Listening, coming out March 2nd. Very special pre-order bonuses. Go to yourbrainisalwayslistening.com. But it's not why I'm here. I'm here because I want to do part 2 of the ancestral dragons. And still, people are like, no sound on Facebook. So go over to Instagram, and I'm going to finish it there and then figure out what is going on here. My apologies. Okay, so let's just talk to our folks on Instagram. Hello, everybody. We are going to talk about the ancestral dragons today, and what are they? These are dragons that actually don't belong to you. They belong to your mother or your dad or your grandmother or your grandfather. What is the influence of your genealogy on you? And what I have learned as a psychiatrist, that a lot of our trauma is actually written into our genetic codes. A lot of the trauma is written into our genetic code. So I just want to read a little bit of this to you. Fear, anxiety, and perhaps even hatred often have ancestral origins. If you are afraid of something and have no idea why, go back through your genealogy to look for any clues that the fear may actually have been something to do with your ancestors' experiences. In a large study, children of depressed parents had smaller volume in the pleasure centers of their brain, making them more vulnerable to depression. Did you do that? In a 2020 paper in JAMA Internal Medicine, authors suggested that the aftermath of physical distancing and COVID-19 will bring a rise in anxiety, depression, substance abuse, loneliness, and domestic violence. It is likely that global trauma will impact future generations. So these dragons rear their head when you try to fix past relationships that were filled with pain. For example, if you grew up in a home with an alcoholic or drug-abusing parent, you might find yourself falling in love with people who struggled with addictions. If you don't work through the painful relationships of the past, they can come back to bite you in the present. So, what triggers this dragon? You might not even know. It could be when you're the same age as someone in your past that was traumatized. One of my patients started to have trouble sleeping when she was 22. Never had any problems before. Never had any problems before. And so she had no idea. And when we went searching for the ancestral dragon, it turned out her mother had been raped when she was 22. and her mother never slept well again. And this was before she was pregnant with my patient. And haven't you seen, I've just noticed this pattern over and over again. When your mother was a certain age, I know with Tana, that when her mother was a certain age and went through a trauma, Tana tended to have traumatic experiences at the same age. And so it's very helpful in therapy to know about your parents, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles. It's just so important. So I have an ancestral dragon. When my grandfather came to this country, he was a teenager, and at the age of 19, his brother, who he just adored, was a bad driver apparently, and ended up in a collision with his car and a train, which killed him. And my grandfather never drove, and he was angry at his sister who lent him the car the rest of their lives. And so if you think about that anger and anxiety, trauma, that actually got written in his genetic code before he even created my dad. And I often wondered why I was anxious as a child, because I used to bite my nails until they bled. And yes, I had an older brother who beat me up a lot when I was younger. And yes, I fell in the crib and hurt, whacked my left side of my temporal area. But I think part of that I inherited and had no idea why until I heard the story from my dad last year, shortly before he died. I encourage all of you to talk to your parents or talk to the family historian and really learn as much about your history as possible, especially if you're struggling with anxiety or depression, insomnia, and you have no idea why. Tana and I interviewed Dr. Mark Wolyn, Wolyn, on our Brain Warriors Way podcast. He wrote a book I liked a lot called It Didn't Start With You. And it's basically about generational trauma. And let me read you another paragraph because it's just heartbreaking. And I know, there's been a lot of societal unrest recently. But did you know children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors have increased risk of anxiety disorders and PTSD? In a similar way, 9/11 survivors, Cambodian and Rwanda genocide survivors, and those who have survived abandonment, people who've had a loved one die by suicide, anyone who has lived in a war zone, or those who have experienced the early death of a child, parent, or sibling, often have their nervous system so deeply affected, pay attention, that it changes the nature of their genes to impact their offspring for generations. For example, children of a parent struggling with PTSD are 3 times more likely to have PTSD themselves. 30% of kids with a parent who served in Iraq or Afghanistan developed PTSD. Native American teens on reservations have the highest suicide rate in the Western Hemisphere. In some places, it is 10 to 19 times higher than other American teens and young adults. It is as if the massacres against Native Americans continue to this day. Some scholars believe generational grief is fueling the epidemics. If you look at Black Americans who have endured racism and mistreatment for about 20 generations, compared to white adults, they are more likely to have feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, and sadness. So you just have to think of the killing of George Floyd that dredged up the ancestral dragons for a whole community of people who felt the hurts not only of the present day social injustice, but also all the racial assaults for more than 400 years. The ancestral dragons intensified the societal disruption. So how do you tame this dragon? Well, recognize if the issues aren't yours, know your family history, work to separate their issues from your issues, reduce exposure to the triggers. This doesn't mean avoiding your family's past or pretending it doesn't exist. Rather, it means you don't have to subject yourself to painful reminders that cause you to relive the trauma, and design a new future. Because yes, trauma is passed down ancestrally, but did you know resilience is transmitted as well? I have affirmations for each of the dragons. I appreciate and honor my ancestors. Sometimes my anxiety may not be from my lifetime, but another lifetime. I work to live in the present and for the future. So I hope you like these talks. For my friends on Facebook, I am so sorry the sound's not working. I have no idea why. Coming March 2nd, your brain is always listening for free gifts. March 2nd, we're also going to do a very special event. I'll have a link to it very soon. Okay, take care, everybody.